Okay, the Manchester Irish Education Group. Let me give you a little potted history. Now, there's a lot more on our website, so I won't go into great detail, but the origins of the charity were back in 1986 when we had a meeting at the Irish World Heritage Centre, the old centre up in Cheetham Hill. And that really stemmed from the race riots of 1981, when people were very angry with the chances ethnic minority people were experiencing in Britain. And one of the particular areas of concern was education, because the educational outcomes for children were very, very linked to their ethnicity. Following that, schools and local authorities began to look at it and began to monitor what was happening and became aware that there were great discrepancies. Round about their first reaction, I suppose, was to introduce multicultural education in the 80s. And by 1986, it was apparent that although various communities were having their community and culture reflected in school, there was nothing for the Irish community, which at the time was the largest ethnic minority group in Manchester, particularly those who go back several generations. So a group of people, including myself, who were involved in education, called a meeting at the Irish Centre. And in the large hall, we had a huge gathering. It was amazing. And I'm pleased to say, thank you. I'm pleased to say that as a result of that meeting, the Manchester Irish Education Group was formed. And I'm also delighted that several of the people who were at the meeting and helped set up the charity are in the audience today. So that's wonderful. People like Les and Rose and Rose Morris and Les and various other people. So I'm delighted at that. The first thing we did was to do a survey of parents to find out what they thought about the education of their children, of Irish parents. And not to our surprise, but the results were quite shocking, that although there were schools where the majority, and I'm talking 70% and plus of the children, were Irish heritage, there was no reflection in the curriculum of those children's cultural heritage, historical heritage, nothing. Even in schools where the majority of the staff were Irish as well, which was interesting. So we set about trying to do something about it. We published the report on the survey. We then sent it to all 10 local authorities in Greater Manchester. We visited many education committees and spoke to it. And they were all in favour. There was a great deal of support because, of course, when you look below the surface, many of our councillors are Irish heritage as well. We then had to become more practical. So we worked with Liverpool University, the Institute of Irish Studies there, on their Irish Cultural Studies Pack, which was quite a compendium of resources, CDs, lectures, activities, books. There was all sorts of materials. So we went around schools and we were able to support schools and introduce it. We carried out helped schools do exchange programs to Ireland, which went very well. We also ran poetry competitions, we did art, we did lots and lots of things. And eventually, of course, we looked at the Irish language and we started some classes for children. And then later on, we started to focus on parents. I think the schoolwork developed, but at the same time, we got requests from adults for some Irish classes. So we started some evening classes, initially down at the College of Adult Education, which was a great institution. That led us on, I suppose, to build a relationship with speakers. And I think as you get really positive feedback from the audience, you work on that and you work on that. With the adults, we began to have educational visits. We visited places in the UK. I remember going to Wales. We went to Ireland, visiting sites of, if you like, Irish historical significance. And they became very popular. So they carried on for quite a while. I suppose the next big event, a big development, was when the National Irish Studies Conference was about to cease, and we thought that was a great shame because every year we'd be taking a minibus of people down to Leicester to this National Irish Studies Conference. So we negotiated with the Leicester people and we took it on board. And from 1996, we started the National Irish Studies Conference. And with the support of councillors, we were allowed to use the town hall, one of the staterooms in the town hall, which we used all the way through until the recent development when they shut the town hall. It's been shut for several years now. So we moved to the Irish World Heritage Centre. And I must say, we've had a really loyal following for those conferences. In that time, we've had something like 147, 149 speakers now. Not one of them have charged a fee. They've all done it on a voluntary basis, which has allowed us to keep the cost of the conferences down to an absolute minimum, basically just covering the costs of the venue and the catering. So those have been fantastic. This is our 25th such conference. So strange, it should be the first virtual conference, but perhaps in the future when we go live, we'll be able to have elements of this virtual conference and the live conference. The other big development, I suppose, and the one that we focus on these days together with the conference, is the Manchester Children's Irish Music Festival. I was approached in 2005 by Jerry Doyle, or Jerry Smith as she became, from the music service, who said that there was such a talent of Irish musicians and dancers in Manchester that we should have a festival to coincide with St. Patrick's Day. So we set about doing it. From 2006, we've run and we've supported the Children's Irish Music Festival. Initially with the Manchester Music Service, which is now One Education Music, and that has just developed and developed and developed. Last year, there were over 1,000 children from over 40 schools who took part in various venues. Again, they were based in the town hall, but because of the closure, we had to use various venues. The Irish World Heritage Centre being key, the Forum in Wintershaw being key as well. I'm going to finish off this slot very quickly, if the technology allows me, with a few tunes. And let's see if we can. This is from last year when we actually were live. This is one of the many school bands. Okay. I was going to share a little bit of the current plan, which is the virtual Irish Children's Irish Music Festival. We haven't got time for that. Just to say that this year they've gone online. The music service band, socially separated on a stage, entertaining children. They've engaged 50 schools, and the festival will take place next week. I've seen the video that's gone out to schools. There are bands, there are dancers, there are singers, and there's the band themselves. So I'm sure it's going to be a great success again. Okay, I'm running over time a little bit. It is 20 past. I hope everybody has managed to come back and is ready for our next speaker. I'm going to call upon Bridie Breen, who is with the Manchester Irish Writers, a poet in her own right. Bridie from Athlone has recited poetry to us before at the national conference and gone down really, really well. So I'll hand the microphone over to Bridie and ask you to do your Imbolc poem, the one that was published in the Irish Post just a couple of weeks ago.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joe and Catherine and Margaret. It's lovely to see everybody here again today. This poem is a series of poems I wrote for the Celtic festivals. I'm very much inspired by Ishnok, the mythological centre in Ireland of all things sacred and Celtic. And it means in the belly. Imbolc means in the belly, very much about connection with earth and land and rebirth. And as an Irish person, you can't have spring without having Bríd, your Celtic goddess, and St. Bridget, my namesake. So this one, here you are, Imbolc. Imbolc calls to rebirth within. A goddess of fertility and fire still burns into my spirit. Nature and instinct align. Spring opens a portal door, breathes life into my Celtic core. Those women gone before us, heroines of their time and space, captured dawns, strength of sun, cupped mooned horizons. Each new day unfurls a truthful grace. A way of courage imprinted on forged paths, deep trodden into heart and mind, soaked up blood, pained bones reaped in death of yesteryears. An arrow shot through infinity, aimed to pierce ice, enliven soil, releases all below to push upwards towards the light. Imbolc flows through my veins, carves its initials on the life tree of my heart. Thank you.
On behalf of everyone, Bridie, we'll have applause later. Oh, that was fabulous. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I think today, of all days, when the women's vigils have been banned by the High Court, it's good to reflect on women and women's issues and what's happening in the world today. Okay. I hope everybody's back. I hope you're all ready for our second speaker, Dr. Ciarán Wallace. He's the Deputy Director of Beyond 2022. I hope you've seen from the literature a little bit about his talk and what he's going to share with you, which I think is an amazing initiative, considering it's now 100 years, virtually 100 years since the archive, National Archive in Dublin was destroyed by fire. And I'm sure those of you with elderly relatives, I know my parents were in the same boat, when they came to apply for passports and had to get official birth certificates and various other documentation, they had a nightmare. They had a nightmare. So it's affected all our lives and our parents' lives and our relations for a long, long time. So this is a fabulous innovation. Ciarán will tell you all about it. Let me tell you a little bit about Ciarán. Ciarán has studied in Dublin, at the universities in Dublin. He's also taught in Liverpool at the John Moores University. So it's an extensive background, both studying and teaching. And he went back to Dublin to take up this role as Deputy Director of this project, which is fabulous. He's done lots of work in the area of archives, including the Down Survey project, which I think in itself would be a fascinating talk in the future. So he's done lots of stuff and he's published lots of materials as well. I won't go into all the detail because we did write it. Okay, Ciarán, over to you. And as we did with Sam, I'll try and keep an eye on the chat, although it's getting quite busy. And I'll try and keep some questions towards the end for you. Okay.
Great. Thanks very much, Joe. I hope everybody can hear me okay, and delighted to be invited and delighted that you were happy to repeat the invitation after the cancellation last year. So I'm just going to share my screen with you here, and in fact, it's a really nice pairing of, oh, where is my screen going now? Hang on. A really nice pairing of talks, I think, because there's all the stuff that Sam was talking about wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the archives and the archivists in the military service pension, in the military archives. And what I'm going to talk about is about archives. So that's very much that same sort of producing the goods, all the work that goes into producing the goods so that people can access the history. What I want to do to talk to you today is to give an overview of like Ireland's kind of tragic archival background, if you like, and then to talk about the Public Record Office of Ireland being established, its successful career and destruction, tragic destruction, and then what we're doing to try and make up the difference, what we're trying to try and repair that damage, if you like. So to begin with, it's recalling Ireland's lost memories in as far as we can, because I'll explain how we're trying to do this. So in fact, it's more than last year's talk reprised, because we've done a lot of work since last year. So the nice thing is we're able to actually go further than we could have done had I given the same talk back in March 2020. I don't really need to point out, sometimes when I'm giving talks, I need to point out why archives are important. Having seen Sam's talk, I think there's absolutely no need to point out why archives are important. Without archives and archivists, we wouldn't have been able to see all the stuff that Sam was talking to us about. I'm a historian, and so I work alongside and use archives a lot. It is amazing the amount of work that goes on. I sometimes think archivists are not good at promoting the good work that they do, because it's detailed, it's extremely time consuming, but the wealth that comes out of it is terribly important. We've seen the merits that can come from, like, say, military archive, but I'm going to talk about a state archive, why you have a state archive. And just to kind of set out, we think going to the archives now, if you look at programs like Who Do You Think You Are, and when we see archives on TV, it's usually somebody doing family history or discovering some, fascinating fact about their area or something. The archives, the state archive, is not built for that reason in the first place. It's built as kind of the business records of the state, so that it can tell what taxes were collected 10 years ago and how many police officers there were 100 years ago. And, it can track its own development as an operational state. So it's created for state officials to know their own backstory. And then we as historians and as the public get to use it for different purposes later. We get to read against the grain, if you like. So the key thing about an archive, and this is completely evident from all the stuff that we've already heard this morning, is it's not just a haystack of paper. Sometimes materials arrive into an archive as a haystack of paper, and it takes many years of flattening, understanding, cataloging to make it accessible. So I'm putting that out now because I want you to understand how huge a job it was that happened in Ireland when the Public Record Office was set up, and therefore how huge a loss it was when it was ultimately destroyed. But to begin with, the destruction of the archives in 1922 was not the first destruction, the first loss of Irish archival materials. We have a long and sad tradition of this happening. So back as far as the Middle Ages, records were kept in St. Mary's Abbey, which was a Cistercian monastery on the north side of Dublin, north of the river. Fine stone house, very robust place to keep your records in. They kept a lot of records there. Accidental fire happened, and lots of important state records were lost. That's going back to only, what's that, like, 100 years, a couple 100 years after the Norman invasion. So it's very early on in this sort of English rule in Ireland story. They realized the threat to records, so they decided to put them into a nice new custom house in the early 1700s. 1711, that nice new custom house went on fire, and records belonging to the Privy Seal Office, which was like the cabinet, if you like, that ran Ireland on behalf of the London government, their records were destroyed in 1711. Over the years, they felt the best place to keep most important records was in Dublin Castle, the most secure place of all, and the Birmingham Tower, a big circular tower. And of course, as fate would have it, there was a fire in the Birmingham Tower, and some records, not an entirely destructive fire, but fire destroyed lots of records there as well. So apart from these sort of accidental fire damage and theft things, there were also just the erosion of records, the less dramatic erosion of records. Records are very often kept in the private residences of officials. So you might be sort of, the chief sheriff of the county Longford, or you might be the assistant deputy mayor of County Waterford or something, and you keep your records for your 20-year career in your own attic. And then when you shuffle off and die, your grandchildren think, oh, these are rubbish, and they put them on the skip. So there's a loss and erosion of records was a huge thing. Plus, these records were made out of paper, out of parchment, out of vellum, things that vermin and mice and moths like to live in. So they were literally eaten. Irish history was eaten over time because there was no one central important place to keep them, if you like. There was also an odd habit, excuse me, of senior English administrators in Ireland, not only the viceroys, excuse me, but senior administrators at all levels would run their career in Ireland and then head home to England with the papers, taking the papers with them. So important collections of Irish papers would end up back in the stately homes in anywhere from Yorkshire to Cornwall, and that's where some of them have survived now. Accidentally, that turns out to be a good thing because it means they survived the fire. But so the tradition of Irish record keeping was very hit and miss for a long time. I have to confess, as a scholar myself, some scholars did thieve and borrow records that were never then seen again. Sorry, excuse me. So the records were kept in a variety of buildings. As I said, some in the private houses of officials, some were kept in the record tower, some were kept in quite fancy stone buildings around Dublin city centre, but they were not built as record keeping places. They were kept literally in the vaults. So the centre top photograph you see there, top engraving, is the Four Courts premises. So the Four Courts is the central court in Dublin. They kept records in the basement in some cases. The basement is below river level, so you can imagine the problems there. They also kept records in the dome, and the dome was built as a kind of a decorative light box, and there were so many records in it that actually was making the dome unstable. The building was actually starting to wobble. They kept them in a variety of buildings around town. So through the 18th and 19th century, this was a big problem. I'm putting just as a memory holder in your mind, in the bottom right hand corner of this slide, a mention of the Irish Record Commissioners. So because so many Irish records have been lost over time, there was a drive to kind of do a backup, if you like, do a kind of preservation job on Irish records. So in 1810, they set up the Irish Record Commission, which was slightly overpaid, quite egotistical experts who were to track down all the most important Irish historical records, transcribe them. So they'd find records from the Middle Ages, find records from Cromwellian times, from Tudor times, transcribe them, and then have a printer print them up and in thousands of copies and distribute them around the libraries of the world. So if the original records ever got lost, the Irish Record Commission publications would act as a surrogate, act as a replacement. So the record commissioners worked away for 20 years, from 1810 to 1830. Lots of infighting, lots of I'm more important than you, I'm more senior than you, I can tell what's more important to write down than you can, and so forth. And in 1830, they were closed down as a bad job. They had been paid a lot of taxpayers' money, hadn't produced a lot of work, and they were just closed down. But hold that group in your mind, because they become important later on. Irish history sees them as a kind of a failure, but in fact they turn out to be accidental heroes later. So, just to point out there, this is the idea of the record tower in Dublin Castle. This is where they kept records, and if you look at the cross section of it, this is a builder's plan, if you like, from a refurbishment of the record tower. It's built like a chimney, so any fire in there would have literally been the most efficient way to destroy the most amount of records had a fire ever really taken hold. So there was no real thinking about the proper premises in which to hold archival records until the 1860s. So in 1867, the Public Record Act of Ireland was passed. There had been one in Britain in the 1830s, so the PRO in London was opened from 1838, I think, but it took about 30 years for Ireland to get its own record office. And this is a map of the area around the Four Courts in Dublin. At the bottom of the screen is the River Liffey. The Four Courts building has its kind of central dome and its wings, and then the Four Courts, the court organisation compulsorily purchased small streets and alleys and lanes behind the Four Courts building, extended to build new court premises, and in the top left-hand corner, they were going to build, or they built, the Public Record Office of Ireland. So that's it in the red box. I've just blown it up a bit there. Sorry, blown it up might be the wrong expression to use when we're thinking of the Four Courts. But so I've expanded the photograph there. If you see in the zoomed in version of it, you can see that there are two parts to the building. There's a smaller block at the front, and then a tiny little neck, and then a long narrow block behind, and I'll explain the importance of that. It's interesting, if you were to look at this map of Dublin and sort of zoom out a little bit, where they built it, beside the forecourts, it's inside the railings of the forecourts complex, but where they built the premises, around it there are two metal foundries with their furnaces, a glassworks with a furnace, and a match factory, all within 1 or 2 streets of the Public Record Office. So it was, I mean, Dublin was a crowded city, but it was maybe an unfortunate place to build a record office. Those did not turn out to be the problem for the Record Office in the end. So here is the premises that they built. This is the Public Record Office of Ireland. The photograph is from 1915, but it's built and opened in 1867. So 1867, two things happen. They get a building and they get legislation, and the two are really important together. The legislation is crucial because it means that a senior officer, a senior official is appointed as the keeper of all the records. So wherever the records are scattered around Dublin or scattered around Ireland, suddenly they all belong to this one individual, this one office. So the keeper of the records can go to any records kept in the forecourts, kept in City Hall, kept anywhere else, kept outside Dublin, and say, you're sitting on my records and I demand you hand them over to me by law and give them to me to bring into my bright new premises. The building that you see came along with the Act. To the front, it's two parts. To the front is the administration block. This is what's called the Record House. And this is where, actually, if you notice, there's chimneys on top of it, lots of open fireplaces. This is where the offices were for the archivists, for all the keepers, for all the staff, the public reading room, open coal fires, gas lights, readers and staff smoking cigarettes and pipes and stuff. So this was seen as the risk building. This is where the problem was going to be. If there was going to be a fire, and they all knew, not only from Irish experience, but from international experience, archives go on fire. So they put everything in the front building, all the risk in the front building, if you like. And if you can see my cursor here on the back building, the building with the tall arched windows is what they call the Record Treasury. And they use that word Treasury. So it shows you the kind of thinking that was going into what they felt about the records. These were Irish national treasures. And the Record Treasury has these 10 tall arched windows down each side, a huge glass roof, so the whole area is flooded with light, and you don't need gas lights. In fact, there was no, and the heating is all done by hot water pipes, so very modern, very state-of-the-art for the time. The interior of the Record Treasury was fitted with metal walkways and metal stairways, and as you went up through the 5 layers, it's 5, I'll show you a photograph of the interior, 5 open metal gantries, again, fireproof. Where they did have to use wooden fittings on things like maybe handrails or some parts of shelving, they specifically investigated and used low or fire resistant timber. So everything was about resisting fire. But the most important thing they did here was this small wall in the center. If you see, there's a front building and a back building, and it looks like they're kind of continuous. This wall that you see inside the red box is like a stage wall. It's a dummy wall. The two buildings don't touch. There's a void in between them, literally a fire break. And the fire break in between, the two buildings are only joined on the ground floor. You can go out of the record office, the record house at the front, through a metal door, into the void area, which was covered just like with a rain cover, and then through another metal door into the Record Treasury. The notion being that if the front building ever went on fire, they could quickly shut the two sets of doors, the gap in between would save the back building, and all would be well. This was the plan behind it. Here is the interior. If you see the interior, it is quite impressive. The sense of that glass roof is interesting. Lots of people, when they see this photograph, they say it looks like a prison, which is kind of interesting because, and I've spoken to people who worked in Kilmainham jail and they thought it looked like a prison as well. But this is where these people worked. The staff who worked there were called the searchers. So it's not a 1950s beat combo band, but actually they were employed as searchers. So you had archivists and sort of clerical white collar staff, and then the searchers who worked in the back. You can see them leaning out into the daylight in the center. So the center atrium is where the daylight pours in, and if they're going to fetch records, they have kind of shelves leaning out into the daylight to fetch the records. And you can see on the ground floor, the tiled floor. Below that tiled floor, there are stone vaults in which they keep more records, again, the full length of the building. So it's about a 55-yard long building, 55-meter long building with a huge glass roof. The building itself is a huge success. The work that they do in here, they're starting to produce, they're starting to put order on the records. They're just reading through all the records, breaking them up into annual bundles if there's records coming from import and export duties, land ownership, court cases, police, army, schools, all those kind of state records pour in. The archivists put them in order. They make finding aids, they make catalogs, they make indexes, and they also make calendars. So I'm a modern historian, so I had never had to use calendars, but people who've ever looked at old records might have come across calendars. A calendar, not in the sense of the 12 months of the year, but a calendar is a summary. So if you have a very big volume of 500 pages, you might write a 2-line summary of each page, and that is a calendar of the original volume. So to save wear and tear, the archivists made calendars of huge extensive volumes so that users could go to the search room, look through the calendar and find out what was in the volume, and then order up that particular volume out of school records or county court records or whatever it was. So they were doing, for 55 years, doing all the things that archives do and that archivists do. And that's crucial. They were also transcribing and publishing the most important records. So lots and lots of records from the Elizabethan era and the Cromwellian era were published during the lifetime of this record office. The reading room here, you see, so this is, if you went in as a member of the public, this is what you would have seen. You go into the reading room, this is the counter here with the wooden sort of writing desk and the pen and ink at the side. Behind the counter, you have the 2 archivists on duty. In this particular case, happily, the guy nearest the camera, so this is the younger man nearest the camera, is D.A. Chart, who goes on to found the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland and is a bit of a hero of mine. And then a bigger hero behind is the man in the distance is Herbert Wood. So Herbert Wood is the archivist who is the boss of the archives in 1922. Ultimately, he rises through the ranks and becomes the boss by 1922. If you can barely make out along the front of the counter, there are bundles of paper hanging from hooks, and they're the call slips. So you'd go in, you'd pull off a bit of paper, you'd write the book you wanted to see and give it to the archivist, who'd give it to a searcher. The searcher would go out through the door in the background, into the void, through the next door into the record treasury, find the record you want and bring it back to you in the reading room, and you'd sit over in the far corner where you've got readers here working away doing their historical research. So this is the only photograph of the interior of the record house, and the light is all coming from a light box in the ceiling above. There's no windows there. So I've introduced you to Herbert Wood, who's the guy on the right here. He is totally my hero. Herbert Wood produced a wouldn't call it a catalogue, it's a guide to the collections held in the Public Record Office of Ireland. It's the only sort of summary document that tries to describe all the collections. It's about 500 pages long, sometimes called the saddest book in Irish history, because it was produced in 1919, not knowing that 3 years later, all of this was going to go up in smoke. So he was making like a handy guide for users like you and me to get a sense of what's in this building. But this book survives as kind of a testament to a lost collection. The book itself actually is kind of interesting because the record office was occupied by the rebels in 1916. So they occupied the GPO and Jacob's Mills and Jacob's factory and so forth, but they also occupied the Four Courts complex and the Public Record Office. The record office itself wasn't damaged in 1916. There was some books were moved around and records were kind of disheveled a little bit, but the archivists afterwards were able to put everything back in order. And when they had re-established order after the 1-week occupation of the Rising, they discovered only one single will was missing, a soldier's will from 1858. Only one single bit of paper that they couldn't replace or replenish from some other copy source somewhere else. But Herbert Wood's guide was meant to be published in 1916. It was all made out in its printer's block, so with the lead type print. This was sitting down in the printer's works down on Abbey Street in 1916. Well, not only did nothing survive of the printer's block in Abbey Street, nothing survived of Abbey Street at the end of 1916. So his book was completely destroyed. But being a good archivist, he had a backup copy, and by 1919 he'd replenished it, and it came out in full version in 1919. So this book became core to the work we're doing to kind of recover from the losses. Other sources, they produce these annual reports in the Public Record Office telling you what they were doing every year. And they produce this map. And this is like a plan of the interior of the building. So to kind of visualize the building, you can see on the left, it's 5 stories high and there's like bays. You'd walk in and there'd be kind of 3 sides of a box. of bookshelves, and these held all the records. And on the right, this big grid is trying to give a visual map of that vertical arrangement of the building. So you can see that, you know, these top floors here, floor 4, 5, and 6 will be the top floors over on the left-hand side of the image, and it tells you roughly what's in each. So we're getting a sense of what was in these records, what was in these bays, what was on the shelves. Since we started work, and this has happened since had I been speaking to you last March, I wouldn't have known this, but since last March, so some of the benefits of being delayed, the National Archives in Ireland have produced lots of administrative records that have survived elsewhere from the fire, and they include the delivery dockets of all the records that poured into the record treasury when it was opened in 1867 and the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s. And on each docket, it says 4 crates of records from County Longford Courthouse, and it itemizes them, and it says what shelf they went to in the record office. So now we have an actual shelf by shelf location for all the thousands of records. So Herbert Woods' 500-page summary book, we now have, I think, something like 14,000 pages of detailed listings of where either things were physically shelved, which is hugely important to us. So now we come to 1922. This links back to actually a point Sam was making. He mentioned Rory O'Connor. Rory O'Connor is the OC of the IRA in Britain during the War of Independence. Rory O'Connor took the anti-treaty side. So you have the Anglo-Irish Treaty, obviously the split between people supporting and not supporting the treaty. On Easter, on Good Friday, Holy Thursday night, the anti-treaty forces under Rory O'Connor took over the four courts, and they seized it in a kind of a reenactment of 1916, if you like. But everything inside the four courts railings was now the Republic as they believed it should be, and everything outside was the pro-treaty Free State. That siege went on, or that occupation went on for 8 weeks. So we always tend to think of the shooting that happened in the final 3 days. But in fact, it was an 8-week-long occupation, and it's fascinating to read about that period in time in Dublin as tensions sort of ramped up. But Ernie O'Malley, one of the officers within the four courts, describes the activity that they were doing inside, that the anti-treaty forces were doing inside the four courts complex. And he describes here, I won't read the whole thing, but he's talking about what's inside the record office. So highlighted there, this is an aerial photograph taken by a British newspaper that came to cover this sort of the standoff in Dublin. It's the only aerial photograph, probably the last photograph of the record office, actually, indeed, before it's destroyed. But you can see it's a very large building with all these tall arched windows. And Ernie O'Malley describes that what we think of as the record treasury, they thought of as the munitions block. That's what they called the record treasury. So that's where they both built their ammunition for the impending battle and where they stored explosives and TNT and so forth. So on the 30th of June, well, the day before, but on the 30th of June, 1922, the Free State forces, I won't explain why the thing reached the peak of becoming a battle. If you want to read about the actual details of the battle and the politics around it, there's a book out last year by Michael Fewer, F-E-W-E-R, called The Battle of the Four Courts, and a very good book, well worth a read. Very forensic examination of the battle and the military deployment and so forth. But the Four Courts complex itself is destroyed, and I'll just show you some images of the level of destruction here. So this is people on the quayside. I don't think you probably have seen lots of photographs of the 1916 Rising and some photographs of the Civil War and the War of Independence. For some reason, people in Dublin roll out onto the street to watch gunfights if it's going on. So here they are watching from a safe distance to see the shelling going on. If you look at the two different colors of smoke, dark smoke coming from the dome of the Four Courts, they're the legal records and the old wood of Gandon's Four Courts. The paler smoke here, that's coming from the western side, and that is the record office smoke. That's the color of Irish history, is white smoke. Here, just some more photographs of the level of destruction. It's a complete gutting of the building. The destruction that happens is, I mean, the blame game almost immediately as to who's to blame. Is it the people shooting shells from outside? Is it the people inside with munitions on the shelves of the record office? But in a battle, you can never tell where things are going to go. Battles by their nature are chaotic. This photograph here is a still from a newsreel footage at the time, and it shows the view of the Four Courts from where south of the river. The river is kind of hidden between the buildings, so you can't see the Liffey at all. Over on the far right-hand corner, you'll see sticking up is Nelson's Pillar. So that's O'Connell Street on the far eastern side. The Four Courts dome is in the middle, and then what you see here is the by now roofless public record office There's the record treasury. The glass roof is gone. It's collapsed in. You see the tall arch windows and the smoke billowing out. Just to mention, to add kind of a layer of kind of tragedy to it, during the 8-week siege, so in 8 weeks, the anti-treaty forces were inside and the Free State forces were outside. And during that 8 weeks, various scholars and historians went to both sides, and they said, you do realize what's inside that the railings is the historic patrimony of Ireland, if you like. It's a paper record of Irish history. And both the commanders of the anti-treaty forces inside the forecourts and the commanders of the Free State military outside said, don't worry, we understand how important it is. Every precaution has been taken, and this is the result. Because, as I say, once a battle starts, you can't really say where it's going to go. So the destruction was very complete. This is inside the complex of the forecourts. We're looking at the eastern side of the record treasury here. It's just a jumbled mess, as you can see. Herbert Wood, the man who wrote the guide, wrote in his annual report. I mean, what do you write as an annual report if this happens in the year? We think that annual reports from COVID are bad. Here's an annual report when your archive has literally been destroyed. The fire left but little but tangled ironwork, blocks of masonry, and charred fragments and ashes of what had once been public records. The metalwork, I presume in the heat of the fire, just went like spaghetti. Just you can imagine it all just collapsing in. I mean, I think the fire and the explosion, once it happened, once the fire took hold, the heat melted all those metal walkways and shelvings, and you can just imagine a cascade of books pouring into like a self-feeding furnace sort of thing as the shelves dipped and emptied their contents into the fire below. But almost immediately, two things happened. One was a blame game, each side blaming the other for destroying this causing this cultural loss. Here, so I've just added this one in. This photograph we got from the National Library only recently, and it's showing the record house. So where we're looking at down a laneway where the artillery gun would have pointed at the front administration block. You can just see the fire safety wall. We're seeing it now from the far side than we saw in the 1915 photograph. The record treasury, the tall arch building, is to the left, out of shot. But here we're looking at the record treasury, and if you look at the top windows, the top 4 small windows in the center, you can actually see some books being used. There's sandbags and books being used as window, securing so the fellas inside can be defended from incoming fire. So this, just gets a sense of how traumatic the whole event was. But the books being used literally as sandbags. If you remember, the design of the building was that the risk would come from the front building. The fire gap was to protect the back building. As it happened, the back building was what went up in smoke, and the fire gap preserved largely the front building. So the fire break worked, but in the wrong direction. And that's been proved key to the work that we're doing. So some things survived. In the vaulted basement, I remembered under the black and white tiled floor, there were vaults there. Records there were baked rather than being burnt. So some of them just crumbled away to dust, but some, particularly the medieval parchments, rolls and things, were on animal skin, and they kind of crumpled. But modern technology can re-moisturize them and open them out again and sort of retrieve them. The fascinating thing is, if you think about the archivists who went back in, people who worked here, went back in after the destruction, pulled out these burnt, the many, many more photographs of these burnt fragments. They said, rather than saying this is just rubbish and it's all destroyed, they carefully boxed them up and held them for 100 years, thinking, well, someday someone might be able to do something with them. And I'll explain shortly. Someday actually has come now, and we are able to do something with these. Even things that look as bad as this can produce some historical facts and data for us. Just show you some of the records that were in the front building. These are the finding aids, the indexes, the calendars, the summaries, transcripts that were in the front building that survived. They were damaged and knocked around. So here you see a shrapnel wound, like a bullet that's gone right through a book, that is in the front building. This is like some administrative record that was being used when the occupation took place, and it survived afterwards. And it gives us the beginnings of a thread that we can start to knit together what was lost. Immediately the work began looking for scraps. So here are photographs of, we think it's Herbert Wood in this photograph in the center. This is the archivist, like the saddest man in the world. He's standing amidst the ruins of the forecourts, looking at burnt fragments of his life's work, of his career, that he spent his entire career, along with many, many other people, building up this brilliant collection. On the left-hand images are from a British newspaper, a photographic newspaper, The Graphic, and it's people on O'Connell Street picking up fragments off the road. where Sam works in the military archives, they actually have some fragments that were handed in the Brother Allen collection in the military archives. So they have like literally pieces of paper the size of the palm of your hand, and you can they've done great work as like some pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and they know what documents they relate to. So these are interesting and they're very sad. In some ways they're so small they tell us very little, but the idea of pulling back together fragments and a public appeal for anything that was sort of cast out into the open sky with the explosion. The appeal was actually not very successful, I think, for two reasons. One was the explosion was so tremendous. When the explosion that happened of munitions that were stored in a basement near the record office, when the explosion went up, the records were cast so high into the sky that they seemed to catch an upward drift of air, and some of them went out as far as Howth Head, which is 8 miles northeast of the city. So they're blown out to the bay, excuse me, and could never be found again. The other point is, a lot of these records fell to grounds in the middle of the opening engagement of the Civil War in Dublin. If you found records and you thought, I might someday hand them in, you're not going to go running out with these on the street while the Civil War is going on. People have other things on their mind. But the initial appeal to try and retrieve records turned out to be extremely unsuccessful. So 100 years passes and we come to beyond 2022, the project that I'm working on. And what this is it started in Trinity College, was started by Peter Crooks and Seamus Lawless, two colleagues of mine. Unfortunately, we lost Shay since the project began, but his work is still very much informing what's going on in the work we're doing. They're historians and computer scientists working together to try and retrieve and to pull together any copies or records that were made during the lifetime of the Public Record Office. So we did this as a proof of concept at the beginning. We said, what records exist out in the world that were copied from the Record Office when it existed? And are there a few, are there a half dozen of these that just sort of interest? When we began searching through catalogues of libraries and archives all around the world, we discovered lots and lots of these materials scattered all around the world. And we thought, well, if you can digitize them or at least bring records of them back together again, you can begin to say, well, of all that was lost, how much of it exists in copy form somewhere else? So we developed a partnership with the National Archives of Ireland, which is the successor institution, the National Archives UK, that's the one in Kew, TNA in Kew, who was like the parent institution of the Irish Archives back in the 1860s, and the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, which was a sister organization that kind of emerged from, at the foundation of Northern Ireland. It was their own archive. Trinity College Dublin, and the Irish Manuscripts Commission, which was the commission to kind of rescue Irish manuscripts set up in the 1930s by the Free State. So all those organizations have never cooperated before on a project. So now they're all cooperating with us, and we're acting as a kind of a link between all of them. It's historians doing the research work and computer scientists making a way to tie it together so that it can be delivered online. It will become, what we are doing is we're making the virtual record treasury of Ireland, the VRTI, and this will be a free public access research platform aimed at the general public. So from school pupils doing projects, local historians, genealogists, university researchers, professional historians, aimed at the full gamut, and it's be funded by the Irish state as a free historical contribution. We're identified as a legacy project coming from the decade of centenaries. So it's part of, because it was destroyed during the War of Independence, Civil War period, it's one thing that will kind of grow forward. Lots of great stuff has happened in the decade of centenaries for commemorating and marking the events, or is it going to be like a living legacy? So what are we doing? We've built using super building construction plans that still exist of the record treasury. The record treasury building, the nearer part in this image here, is completely destroyed. The building is not there anymore. The front building, the administration block, survives, but has been reworked as a courthouse now. It's the court number 7, I think. So we've made a virtual reality model of the building. You can go back and step inside a building that no one's seen in 100 years. If you remember the photograph I showed you of the interior where the searchers were working, well, this is when I first saw this, when our computer scientists made this VR model of the interior and they showed me a still shot of it, I thought somehow somebody had colorized an original black and white photograph from 1867. I didn't realize this is an entirely new creation, and now it's animated. I won't show you an animation. I can give you a link where you can try it out yourselves later on if you wish. But so now we have the bays, shelves, it's all open, pristine, clean and new, ready to be repopulated with records. The interior of the reading room, just to show you, if I mentioned we know on the shelves where things were situated, so we're able to know exactly to a very detailed level what was in the building and also to find, if we find records, what, whether they were in the building or not, or where they might have sat in that building. So we can begin to replace things on shelves and sort of make a virtual guide so you can find your way around the records as if you were back in 1922. The reading room, that's where we met the guys earlier on, Chart and Wood. This is the virtual model of the reading room. This is something we only added on in the past few months. We're still building this. This is still a work in project, work in progress. You'll be able to go in, tour the reading room, and records will come back to you in the reading room. So what are we looking for? There were lots of copies made at the time. So sometimes a state official in the 1700s or 1600s might have made an original and made a copy to send to London, and the copy in London might survive and the original in Dublin is lost. Certified copies, a certified copy of a will or a land deed or what have you. Transcripts and calendars and indexes, any of those archival finding aids survived in the front office or that made their way around the world. They got scattered after 1922 as well. Scholars' research notes as well survived. And then I think we've invented this idea of para replacements. So imagine a series of letters over centuries between Dublin and London, administrative letters going out from Dublin to London and back from London into Dublin. So this continuous government stream of letters to and fro. All the letters in Dublin are destroyed, but all the outbound letters in London survive. So we can't say they were in the record office, but they can tell us the story of what was in the record office. So we count them amongst the stuff we want to know about. And of course, archives around the world don't file their things by, was this connected to the Dublin Record Office? So when we go and speak to archivists, explain what we're doing, they usually say, no, we don't have a category for what you're talking about. But they usually come back a week later and say, well, actually, we do have this other stuff that would work. And it seems to all refer to Dublin. And when we get in and look at it, we realize that there could be a wealth of stuff that's there. Sometimes it's tiny little threads, little grains. So for example, here's a tiny grain of one that I was really pleased to find, just because it's an example of how accidental some of these finds can be. The Capuchin friars in Dublin have an archive, in Ireland have an archive, and they had a cause for sainthood for one of their brothers, Father Fiacre Tobin, back in the Cromwellian era, who was transported and died. He was transported as a Catholic priest and died on the, being transported, died, I think, in the Caribbean. To make a cause for him in the early 20th century, to make a cause for his sainthood and to make the huge paperwork that has to go to the Vatican, they went into the record office in about 1919 and they were photographing the actual record of Father Tobin being arrested and transported and the reward to the guy who'd shopped him to the Cromwellian forces to transport him. So there was this little paper trail in the record office and they said, we need to get a photograph of this and send it over to the Vatican in the cause for sainthood. I think he was subsequently, I don't know if he's canonized, but he'd be beatified, I think, under John Paul II many years later. But in the Capuchin records is this photograph that they took, but the Cromwellian record book is burnt and gone. But now this is very rare that they would take something as modern as forward thinking as a photograph of a record. So I like that as one single half page. That is the thing. Royal Irish, some of the major libraries and academies around the country, the university libraries, Dublin, Cork, Belfast, all have materials here. These would often be 19th century transcripts. So you've got a scholar in 1890 or something writing out longhand, copying out longhand in the day before photocopiers, and then the original is lost and the copy is now the only surviving version we have. This one, for example, the Huguenot records. So the Huguenots were the French Protestant refugees that fled from the Catholic kings of France in the 1690s to Britain and Ireland. They were very well established in Dublin by this stage, and the Huguenots kept their own sort of French Protestant identity. By the 1910s, the Huguenots had thought, well, we've got these very ancient records. We don't like keeping them in our own houses and in our sort of clubhouse, if you like. We'll give them to the safest place in all the world, the Public Record Office of Ireland, which is fireproof. So they deposited their records into the record office. Similarly, tragically, with the guild records. So these are the trade guilds, the goldsmiths, the glove makers, the felt makers, the carpenters guilds, medieval guild records of Dublin. Lots of guilds by about 1900, 1910 decided we will also deposit ours in the Public Record Office because it's so safe and so secure. So as you read the records of the record office, you see these things pouring in. It's quite heartbreaking because we know what's going to happen next. But in this case here, the Huguenot records, somebody was studying Huguenot records, went in about 1919, wrote down longhand some transcripts from the Huguenot records, and then 2 years later saw in 1922 the record office was destroyed, including the Huguenot records, and he deposited these with Marsh's Library beside St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. So an amazing survival. We know exactly what book number and shelf it was in the record office, and here's a full transcript copy sitting in Marsh's Library. So these are all fascinating, small little examples. Here is Sybil Kirkpatrick. So she was interested in doctors' wills, and she used to go in regularly to the record office. And if you remember, I was talking at the front of the counter, you had those pieces of paper that you pulled off to write your reference number on to call up a document. There's one that she used as a bookmark in her own records. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see Sybil is, you can see where it's torn, where she's pulled it off the nail and she's filled in the thing and given it to the archivist and used it as a bookmark. And her transcript of wills all survive, about 120 wills out of tens of thousands. I know it's only a tiny fraction, but again, it's the type of thing we want to find. The earliest manuscript record in the National Library of Ireland is only a copy, not very important, only a copy. It was a copy made in the 1740s by a scholar sitting with a medieval record from the Norman times in front of him. He transcribed out this thing, and that Norman record was then stored in the Public Record Office of Ireland when it opened a century later. And this only a copy in the National Library of Ireland is now the only surviving. So this is something written in 1740 of a document of 1291. So this is quite soon after the Norman invasion. This document, so it's separated by centuries and by layers of transcription, but its sort of wanderings are a fascinating story in its own right. And again, it's a type of the 600 pages in this document, so it gives you some sense of the riches that are there. You might remember I spoke about the Irish Record Commission, these kind of overpaid, egotistical guys who fought amongst themselves and were closed down in 1830. Unfortunately, they were closed down just at the wrong time. All their transcriptions, all their stuff they were getting ready for print was nearly ready for print in 1830 when they were closed down. They sold off the records, they got scattered literally all around the globe, and we've been tracking them down. We're now finding Irish Record Commission transcripts. So these are scribal transcripts written by professional writers, so beautifully, neatly written, multiple volumes, hundreds and hundreds of pages, volumes of records written in the 1820s and 30s, of records from the 1700s, 1600s, 1500s, and medieval period. So extensive collections of these. Some are in California, Trinity College Dublin, the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, Maynooth University Library, and in the National Archives itself. Overall, there's over 350 large volumes, 25 million words of Irish history. Now, they were known, every archive knew they had them, but they didn't necessarily know they all were part of one original collection. We can leave them all on their shelves where they are now, but digitally draw them all back together and remake that collection in a kind of a virtual world. There are records in Manchester. The John Rylands in Manchester. We were due to go over to them just before lockdown, but we'll pick them up again when we're allowed out to play again. They've got two very interesting records that they're copying for us and contributing as digital materials to our collection. Both are from the 17th century, and these are land and taxation rolls and Cromwellian land grants. Bridie in her poem was talking about Imbolg and land and connection to the soil. The amount of records in the Public Record Office connected with land, taxing land, seizing land, granting land, complaining about land is enormous. So it's like soil is running through people's veins. It's amazing. So every city and every county, we haven't got everywhere yet. We haven't got enough staff to get everywhere yet, but Manchester's one. And when I was talking to John Rylands, they said, and I said I was speaking to you guys, the contacts there, she said to me, I said, make sure to tell them everyone's welcome in John Rylands. It's not this closed elite place, but if you're interested, please go in and register, and they'd be delighted to help with any queries that you think are useful to anything that your audience are interested in. Other records that are there, the census records in the 19th century were all destroyed. So they were not all lost in the 1922 fire, some were lost earlier, but the census records have been, so the thing we've been trying to focus on. So other things which were pre-census, so these were in 1766, before the state was taking records, it was an inquiry into the religion of people in Ireland. And so they did this religious census in 1766, and these turn up in all sorts of places because lots of people were interested and copied this out. So here's a neatly typed version in the Representative Church Body Library, so the Church of Ireland Library in Dublin. Lots of this in Prony and Belfast as well, listing Papists and Dissenters and Protestants, so Dissenters being Methodists or Presbyterians, not Methodists, but Presbyterians at that stage, and listing out, with their who's in every townland in many of the counties of Ireland, not 100%, but a large number of these are turning up as well from the 1760s. So I'm not sure how I'm doing for time there. I'll keep speeding on. The problem with all these handwritten records, we can scan them, put them up online. But if I put up a 500-page handwritten document for you to read, you think, well, I'm just looking for a reference to my name or my town place or whatever. It's too much work to find everything, but you have to read through it. And we know you can word search for things online if you've done a full transcript, and transcription is really expensive to get somebody to pay them to transcribe it, and they overlay the transcription on the image and the computer can find the word. So it's too expensive to do for a small project like us. But happily, at the same time as we were working, an EU-funded project had just finished producing a new computer program which can read handwriting. We didn't believe it was possible either, but actually it is, and we've used it extensively. You train it, so we have to have lots and lots of writing by the one person in the one hand, but you train it to read a large sample of this handwriting, it gets it right, and then you can start pouring in many, many more pages of this writing. Happily, back in the 19th century, people learned how to write in very neat copperplate, and in the 18th century, they were writing in court hand and so forth. So we're now producing tons of writing out of this. What you just see here is just a random page, just as an example, where a 19th century page is put into the machine and out it produces about an 85% accurate transcription. The idea would not be to publish this on its own, but it allows you to find police person names and place names, and that's what people normally want to find in a document. So it gives quick access to lots and lots of material. For example, if you search for Galway, there's various ways of spelling Galway, but here it's fine. So, are you okay? Oh, got a mic on. But if you're searching for Galway, the computer will know to search for misspellings or different variant spellings of Galway as well. And you might need to know this if you're looking for everything to do with the city of Galway. And it doesn't only search just for the modern spelling you expect, it gives you other alternative spellings. Once you've got all these words transcribed, all these millions of words from various places around the world transcribed, they have to pour into this virtual record. This is just some prototypes we're thinking about how to make all this searchable. This is the doll's house model, and we're I'm saying playing, it actually is quite good fun, dealing with computer scientists as they try and say, how can we make this usable so that everyone can get what we're doing, because it's quite a complex thing behind the curtain. So one of the things we're doing to make it is this doll's house where you can enter the building. You don't have to have goggles, although it works with goggles, but you can, on your screen, you can enter the building, go in, move around, go up onto the 5th floor, 3rd floor, look into different bays, and then land on an item that you want to see. You can see a shelf and say, right, what was on it and was all lost, and then this one is found and this one is found, but everything in between is now still not found. So where something is found, where we found a transcript or found a replacement item, you can then go to the reading room and open it online and see the document. The last thing I'll just talk to you about is the knowledge graph. Because all of these transcribed documents are data, effectively. The computer scientists just see a person's name and a place name and an office like Lord Mayor or Chief Secretary. They're just bits of data for them. They can link all these together across time. So you could be looking for, I'm interested in County Carlow in the 1798 rebellion, but it can then link out to all these other linked items about Carlow, court cases, buildings, roads, grand jury records for Carlow, education records for Carlow, and suddenly you see a network of Carlow related information in a way that would never have been possible in 1922 when the original paperwork was actually on the shelf. So do go to our website and have a look. Beyond2022.ie is the website. This is just a brochure website. This is not the resource. This is just to show you the work we're doing. On the centenary in June 2022, we will reveal a completely different resource, which will be much more user-friendly. This is just our sort of teaser sampler thing. And if you want a teaser sampler thing, go to, I might drop this into the chat later on, this link here, beyond2022/VR, and it's a bit dizzying, takes a couple of minutes to load. We think it's worth sharing. It is the virtual reality model. It allows you to using your mouse and your up, down, left, right arrows to go into the building and begin to move around. I keep walking into walls and doors and I'm doing it, but it's hilarious, but it gets you some sense of the building itself. And so finally, do follow us on, if you're on Twitter, on Facebook, have a look, keep an eye out for what we're doing. And I think, I'm not sure if I've run over time there, Joe, so I'll stop there and let people have some questions. So yes, thanks for listening. Okay, Ciarán. Can you hear me? I can hear you fine, thank you. Well, thanks very much for that. It was an amazing project, amazing work you're doing. I've been reading about it now for a couple of years, so I'm absolutely fascinated. Amazing, amazing. We've had a couple of questions in. If anybody else has got questions, then please send them on the chat and I'll try and pick them up.
A very interesting one that's arrived from Carmogul is this is not the only library in the world that's been destroyed by war. And he quotes Baghdad and Alexandria Library. Are there any parallels? Are there any lessons that you could share with other libraries of the world that have gone through a similar project, or is each library unique?
No, it is definitely something we are interested in sharing. So we are working, we're also hosting a series of lectures about other libraries and cultural institutions that have been destroyed over time. So we're very aware of this notion of, I mean, for instance, in the 20th century alone in Europe, 70 national level archives and libraries were destroyed by war or by flood or by riot or disorder of some sort. So it is unfortunately a terribly common thing. Interestingly, the United Nations, UNESCO did a survey in the 1990s, I think, where they were trying to survey all the countries that had lost archives and libraries, in the 20th century, and Ireland did not submit an entry. So Ireland didn't see this as an Irish loss. I think they saw it as an English loss before independence. So nobody recorded this with the United Nations, which is interesting. But the idea of sharing our research, absolutely. And the computer science and the approach we're taking, the methodology we're taking, will all be open access. We're in contact with lots of different related type in groups. We learn from them, and then we want to share with them what we're doing. So this is an Irish funded thing, but it's very much open access. And if the methodology works for someone in Alexandria or whatever, we're keen to share and keen to cooperate.
Okay, we've had a question from Hannah Lynch. Are there any copies of any 19th century census forms? Or is that 18th century census forms?
The census is the thing that if I could make any one thing appear, it'd be the census. So the census began, it was a census in 1821 and then 31, 41 and so on through the decades. Some of the earlier censuses were on the shelves in the record office and were lost in 22. Some of the later censuses were actually deliberately destroyed by the state in order to create pulp paper during the First World War. So before the 1922 fire at all, they had been destroyed. But the National Archives of Ireland has an excellent sort of survey of replacement census material, where, you see, the census was a private confidential document. So you couldn't just wander in and see it. You couldn't just make whole-scale copies of it. So it's security was one of the things that meant no copies were made, so it's very hard to replace it. But there were sometimes official versions made to support pension claims, to support particular pieces of state research, and those tiny fragments, 1% and 2%, have survived in other collections. The National Archives of Ireland has the best summary of that situation. Of 18th century census, there was the 1766 religious census, and there were things called the hearth rolls, which were like a taxation census created in the 17th century. So it's a thing that we keep a specific eye out for. When we launch our virtual record treasury, this is the whole new world thing we're launching on the 30th of June 2022. So in whatever 16 months time, 17 months time, we will have like a census just like a census virtual room, let's say, where we'll try and make it into something that people are just interested in census type material. A thing to remember is people they just want to know what census. I want to see my great-great-grandmother's name, which is what I want to do on a census. But of course, the census also recorded lots of information about streets and states and the quality of housing and the social conditions that people lived in, and all of that survives. So we want to unite those things back together as well, so that it'll be people and place, not just people, so that even if you can't find your particular ancestor, but you know the townland they were in, that you'll be able to see quite all in one place as much information through a couple of centuries about that one townland, maybe old maps, census records, religious surveys from an earlier period, that sort of thing. But census is something we're very keen on hunting down.
Okay, Ciarán, we've another question has come in from June and John Freeman. I have a recollection of looking at tithe allotments records in the forecourts in the 1970s. Was that possible?
Yes, you remember quite rightly. The tithe allotments did survive. I think they were actually stored in a land court. They came into the National Archives post 22, so I think they actually were held in a separate location. So the tithe allotments are normally early 19th century. So the tithes were the religious taxes that everybody paid to maintain the Church of Ireland as the established church. So they were tied to amount of land you owned. You paid a tax based on the land. So they're a very good replacement type census material. The tithe allotments tend to be 1830s, and they are I think extensively available. So the tithe allotments and Griffith's land valuation also keeps a record of who rented or owned land. So there's actually, I mean, if you were to look at Irish land records going right back to the Norman settlement, I think Ireland and its land and every square foot of land is probably more densely recorded and archived and measured and handed and ownership recorded than anywhere else in Europe, because it was just such a contested thing. So the land records, the tithe allotments they do exist, and they are, I think, lots of those online actually now through various paid resources, but the National Archives have the tithe allotment records for sure.
Interesting. That sort of reflects the Irish,
The field.
I say, mania with land.
Absolutely,
I've seen
totally.
the
It's
field.
the field.
Okay, yes. We've also had quite a number of inquiries about genealogy. And when I know you're going to make the big announcement in June 2022, but when do you think, what's your best estimate when the ordinary person doing genealogy might be able to access the archive and help them in their work?
June 2022, they will be able to access it. So that's the day when we've committed to government, and that's what they're paying us to do, is to produce a resource which will be useful to, as I say, school children, genealogists, professional historians, the whole works. It will be constantly going. So we will platform and make available everything we've found by June 2022. But we know already that there's big collections which we just cannot absorb by that time. So we'll be able to give a taster of those and add to it. So there'll be constant releases or pulses of stuff after June 2022, but anything we find on census and anything we have will be released on June 2022, and in a way that allows people, it's in a way if you've been on some websites, maybe you might see if you get the wrong information, you get a dizzying amount of replies, whereas we're trying to make it something that's sensible and logical, people can just understand intuitively when they've asked a question and they get the answers in. So genealogical research, local history research, school project research, all those people will be able to use it on the 30th of June 2022. The stuff that's on the current brochure website are like teasers and tasters to give you a sense of where we're going with it, really. But I think genealogy, yes, watch out for us in June, 30th of June 2022.
Okay, another interesting question from John Commons. How did the 19th century Griffiths land valuation manage to survive?
Again, the land valuation, they were in, by just the administration of land was so vast and so complex that there were land records held in the Landed Estate Court, which was in a different premise. The Landed Estate Court was scattered around different parts of the city. So their central records, and they also had duplicates. So that while there was tons of land records lost in the record office, because you had things like bankruptcy of landlords and tenants disputing their rents and all this kind of stuff, the working day-to-day courts needed lots of copies of material. So there was extensive transcripts and copies available in the working court system. So when the forecourts was destroyed in 22, over a number of years, the new National Archives of Ireland just retrieved all those records and brought them back in. But the Griffith valuation was a public document. I think it was published, actually. I think there were printed copies of that. So what we're mainly concerned with is manuscript, one version only, like unique things that were then copied by hand. But if Griffith's valuation was published, there might have been records, there might have been versions of it in London, might have been versions in Belfast, and versions in other offices in Dublin. But Griffith's is one of those, again, multiple layers of land measurement stuff. My own family don't come from any land at all, so I can never find my family because they were urban, poor and trash from the middle of Waterford. But anybody who's connected with the tiniest bit of land has much better chance of finding records.
Right. And will those land records be kept separate to the virtual archive, or will they one day perhaps be incorporated?
They'll be linked out, I think. Our brief is to find anything that was in the record office and replenish it. So anything we can find that we can say, we know what shelf it was on and here's a link to it. But we know that in a way, the real value is linking between collections. So if you go into our record treasury and you say, right, I'm interested in my ancestors from Limerick and I know the townland, and you find one little thread and there might be some small mention that we found of that townland and maybe that family name. But that's that's like a silo that's all on its own. That's like one standalone fact, and that's a real frustration if you're doing genealogical research. Our knowledge graph that links all the different collections is a huge piece of work. I don't even understand it, but the computer scientists tell me it is a way that you can find that one little thread of one ancestor and one townland in Limerick, and that's all you have. But it'll say also, did you know this person also appears in Griffith's valuation? They also appear in the tithe allotments, and what appears to be someone with the same name on the same townland a century earlier was involved in a court case or a fishery rights case or something like that. So they're different networks, different websites, different databases, but that our database will reach out to all of them and allow you to kind of get as much as we can, see the web of information that's surrounding your particular inquiry.
Right. Okay, Ciarán.
That's the ambition.
I think we'll bring it to a close there. We'll say thank you very much. You've raised a great deal of interest. In fact, so much so that we've had a question from Hannah. Do you take volunteers?
Not yet, but we will. I think we will need some kind of crowdsourcing or some volunteer thing. But at this stage, we're too small a group to do it. But it is something that I think there's so much public interest that we'll have to have some kind of crowdsourcing and volunteer intern type of system going. Probably after 22, when we got a fuller team, I think, in place. Hopefully.
Talk about sustainability. What is your future beyond 2022? Will the government continue to source it?
Yes, well, I'm saying yes, I'm not the one writing the check. The government have said to us that this has to be sustainable. As one senior civil servant said, we lost all this in 22, we can't lose it all again in 2022. Like, digitized things don't just survive, they have to be constantly maintained and migrated onto new forms of software and so forth. So we're building a very comprehensive plan for the government to say, well, this is how the thing will survive for 100 years in a digital form. It can't just be, lots of digital collections fall over. The Kane collection in Northern Ireland on the Troubles nearly fell over recently due to lack of funding. We can't risk this falling over just because of technology and lack of investment. So the sustainability of our organization and of our data, of our sort of digital images and all this sort of stuff is something that we're building a plan for, and the government has said that's something they want to look at the long-term funding for. So we're not ending we're starting in June 2022 rather than ending in June 2022.
Fabulous. That's great news.